Welcome back to another instalment of New Zealand's Bird of the Week, where in this video I will be talking about the Huia, the largest of New Zealand's wattlebirds that also exhibited some of the most apparent sexual dimorphism in bill shape of any birds, that are now unfortunately sadly lost to time. I hope you enjoy. Among our most iconic and distinct extinct endemic birds, Huia were certainly very striking birds and were very unique in a lot of ways, also having a very up and down history in terms of their preservation and eventual extinction. Beginning with their appearance, Huia were very distinctive, having an overall glossy green and black coat with a metallic sheen, alongside bright orange wattles at the base of their bills. This gives away their classification rather clearly, with them being the largest members of the New Zealand wattlebird family, being about the size of the Australian magpie, whereas the saddleback and kokako are a good deal smaller. At about 300 through 400 grams in weight, with the males generally being slightly smaller. They also had long white tipped tail feathers, which will be discussed more in detail later on in this video, with their beauty having big implications regarding their eventual extinction. Their legs were also very strong and large, which allowed them, like their smaller kokako relatives, to easily hop around dense canopy and branches, though like them, they also had the trade-off of having small and short rounded wings, which meant that Huia were pretty weak flyers. Their most identifiable and also most notable traits came in the form of their bills, which were dramatically different depending on the sex, being among the most, if not the most, extreme case of sexual bill dimorphism in any bird species. Female birds had a very long, slender and decurved bill, which was about 100mm long, with males having a sturdier and more straight bill, which was about half the length of their counterparts. Their difference was so apparent that John Gould, who described them in 1836, considered them as two different species, being Neomorpha acutirostris based on the female specimen, and A. cresirostris on the male. It wasn't until 1850 when John Cabanis replaced the name of Neomorpha, which had instead been used for a cuckoo genus prior, with the first species name of acutirostris for the female birds being carried over to being used for both of the sexes. Explaining why the birds' bills were so different proved to be an interesting discussion, with one hypothesis suggesting that a pair of birds would feed cooperatively, with each sex complementing the other when it came to their obtaining of food, with their different types of bills assisting them in catching different types of prey. Walter Buller, among the most well-known of early New Zealand ornithologists, who has been noted many a time on the channel across many other Bird of the Week videos, kept a pair of birds in captivity for over a year, and noted that when presented with a decaying log full of larvae, the male birds would chisel and move chunks out of the way to reach their food, while the females would probe the more dexterous bills into the areas the males could otherwise not reach. This idea caught on and was particularly prevalent in earlier popular accounts on Huia behaviour, though it's generally now considered to be misinterpretation on how they came to be. Today, the radical bill dimorphism is considered to be an adaptation for them to explore different habitat niches and avoiding intraspecific competition for food, and allowing them to exploit a wider range of food sources in different habitats rather than active cooperation. The expansion into two different feeding niches has also been hypothesized to be down to the reduced competition from other species with similar foraging ecology typical of island environments. This can be supported by the lower degree of dimorphism seen in other birds such where high levels of sexual dimorphism are seen, such as the case with the tremblers. These birds, related to mockingbirds, have a lower degree of dimorphism on islands where competitors are present, which matches closer with the Huia, where no direct competitors had much of a presence. Saddlebacks, while also foraging under bark in a similar manner to male Huia, lack much of the specialised jaw musculature of the larger Huia, and are also smaller and not nearly selective in their foraging habits, leaving the evolutionary door wide open, as it were, for Huia to diversify their feeding strategies amongst themselves. Female birds, as another aside, may well have been the main provider of food for their chicks, given that they had the longer bills to better reach into trees to retrieve the protein-rich insects necessary to feed them, though given their extinction and relatively little documentation, substantiating this further is very hard to determine. This lack of documentation and understanding of them means other aspects of Huia lives, like their breeding behaviours and overall habits, are left tantalisingly fragmented and shallow, though there were some things that were found of them. In terms of their social behaviour, they were quiet and often seen together in their monogamous pairs that likely paired for life, and also sometimes in small groups of 4 or more, which were likely family groups. It was recorded from Walter Buller's tame pair that they would always keep close to one another, often uttering a low affectionate twitter, with there being records of this same pair and other wild pairs, quote, hopping from branch to branch and fanning their tails, then meeting to caress each other with their bills. The males were also said to have fed the females in some kind of courtship routine, and one of them was either killed or passed on, as was seen in the case of the male captive Huia under Bulla's care. The female birds apparently became highly distressed, and the one with Bulla died a mere 10 days afterwards as well. Little was known about their reproduction, as only 2 eggs and 4 nests were ever described. What is known was that their breeding season, alongside laying eggs and raising young, is thought to have occurred around late spring, October through November, with Huia appearing to have raised just 1 brood per season. Variously described as laying anywhere from 1 to 4 to 3 to 5 eggs, they were greyish-blue with purple and brown speckles, with much of the incubation being carried out by the females, though the males also seem to have had a role, as rubbed bare breeding patches, though to a lesser degree than in female birds, was also present in the males, so they were doing something there. The nests were constructed in varying places, often in dead trees and in the crooks of large branches, with the nests being large saucer-shaped structures which are up to 350mm in diameter. After the eggs hatched, the young would remain in their family group for about 3 months, being fed by their parents, at which point they would afterwards appear as adults themselves and fledge. Huia are thought to have undertaken seasonal movements, living up in montane forests in the summer months, and then moving into lowland forests in the winter to avoid the harsher and colder temperatures of the higher altitudes. It was also written by Bulla that the Huia, quote, never leaves the shade of the forest, end quote. They apparently also, like Kokako, hopped or jumped along the ground or in trees, keeping under the cover of the canopy rather than flying above it. Because of their extinction in the early 1900s, as will be covered soon, no recording of the birds themselves were ever made, which is a shame considering they're apparently pretty adept and proficient singers. The birds were named for their loud distress calls, which sounded like a smooth and unslurred whistle sounding like the words, "Where are you?" This call was skillfully mimicked by Maori hunters, who added variations made up of their notes whilst the birds were feeding and or searching for food. Much of their songs were said to be very much like those of the Kokako, only softer and could carry for a considerable distance, some being audible from up to 400 metres away through dense forest. The calls were also said to differ between the sexes under different contexts, with male and female birds calling to each other in different ways. They were apparently among the earliest birds to call in the morning under the dawn chorus, and captive birds were known to wake up their households in the early hours of the day. Like the smaller and unrelated whiteheads, Huia too also behaved unusually before the onset of wet weather, apparently being very chirpy and in full song. We do actually have some audio, though not directly from them, in the way of Henry Hamana, who was a part of a search party who attempted to find the living birds in 1909, though they were unfortunately unsuccessful. Hamana was later brought on in 1949 by the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation to preserve the call of the birds before the direct knowledge of them was lost forever. Hamana, at this point in his 60s, recorded what amounts to a conversation between a male and female bird, with them also having accompanying details on their context and also why they were used. Thanks to modern technology, English ornithologist and composer David Hindley attempted to recreate the sound of the Huia using a synthesizer and his computer, using the original recordings by Hamana to get a basis for what he would end up with. After going over birds like saddleback and tui, Hindley slowed the recordings of these birds down, and from there could better ascertain their rich musical complexity, which he was then able to capture on a computer-generated score. This recreation is therefore among the most authentic we can get to hearing a living Huia in the present day without some form of time travel, and really brings home that while we can hear them to an extent, they are now gone, and not even that long ago to boot. Their eventual extinction in the early 20th century came down to a multitude of reasons: ecological, cultural, political, and economic, much of the latter stemming from colonisation. Huia were well regarded by Maori, having an iconic significance because of their beauty, and their white-tipped tail feathers being a revered tauanga or treasure, which marked a high status. Their name overall also came to be associated with treasured things, ranging from items to the containers which housed them, which were known as waka Huia. Although the Huia were restricted to the southern North Island after Maori arrival, their feathers were so valued that they were exchanged across tribes far and wide across New Zealand, often being traded for other valuable goods such as ponamu and shark teeth, or to be given as tokens of respect and friendship. The feathers would often reach the far north and the far south of New Zealand through such trading, with dried Huia heads also sometimes being worn as pendants. Huia populations were however not doing too well, with them suffering from habitat loss through land clearance conducted through burnings across the North Island, of which they were once widespread across, eventually being restricted to the more mountainous areas of the southern half of the North Island, mostly around the Tararua and Rumataka ranges and the northern Wairarapa, as well as around the hills surrounding Wellington. Not found in the South Island at all, this meant that the birds were in a very compromised position, and even if Europeans hadn't arrived, the birds would have almost certainly continued to the slow decline towards extinction. For one, the major forest burnings across much of the North Island, while leaving much of their mountainous forest habitat intact, meant that many Huia populations could not as easily migrate down from these areas in the winter months, given said habitats were now few and far between. This was very bad for them, as Huia appeared to have been unable to adapt to life in second growth regenerating forest, as the old growth forest that they were commonly found in had an extensive amount of older rotting trees in which their food was more likely to be found. The introduction of many new mammalian predators like ship rats, cats and mustelids were also a major problem for them, as the birds spent a lot of time on the grounds and were of course naive to their presence. An estimated 50 to 80,000 birds were alive when Europeans arrived in New Zealand, but alongside the threats they faced from habitat clearance and mammalian predation, their distinctiveness proved just to be as potent a problem for them. Naturalists of the day, who correctly identified them as a great wonder due to their remarkable bills and plumage, incorrectly sought to harvest them in large numbers for overseas museums and collectors, with non-scientific traders also shooting them in large numbers to mimic the Maori custom of wearing Huia tail feathers in their hat bands. Their decline was recognised in 1890, where legal protection was put in place on them after calls from some local Maori groups in 1892, including them into the new Wild Birds Protection Act after some amendments, making it illegal to kill them, though this enforcement was not taken all too seriously. Destruction of Huia habitat continues, and this was noted as such by Buller, who remarked, quote, "The Maoris, with their usual directness, struck the nail on the head when they said to the government, 'You have prohibited the killing of the Huia under a heavy penalty, and yet you allow the forest, whence it gets its subsistence, to be destroyed. Where is the consistency of that?' End quote. Recommendations were made to set up island sanctuaries for Huia and other such endangered native and endemic birds, including onto Little Barrier and Kapiti Island, though no transfers were ever made. The Kapiti Island attempt was documented as being especially poorly managed, with a live pair that was tasked to be sent to the island in 1893, instead being appropriated weirdly enough by Buller, who bent the law to take them to England as a present for Lord Rothschild, alongside with the last collected live pair of laughing owls. In this weird, paradoxical way, Buller, who had been trying to send a live pair to Rothschild for 3 years, took the opportunity to obtain some birds, with them sending the birds to England in the following year. Buller had the Darwinian, though at the same time flawed view that the indigenous fauna and flora, not to mention the people of New Zealand, were doomed to be replaced by the apparent fitter European colonists, and that the native wildlife and the Maori people would inevitably die out, with little to be done in the ways to protect them, given that they were viewed as inferior. As compassionate colonists, a bit of an oxymoron there, Buller essentially believes that while they were declining, their demise should be smoothed out as much as possible, which extended to the Huia as well. This flawed logic seems to explain well how Buller and others of the time believed that conservation was destined to inevitably fail, while also supporting movements to protect them. This flawed logic seems to explain well how Buller and others of the time believed that conservation was destined to inevitably fail, while also supporting moves to protect them, and also continuing to take them as specimens, given that collecting such birds was quite profitable. Continual hunts were made by individuals like Travers and Jacobs, who were fined around £5 for shooting a bird, equivalent to about £1,000 today, though this did not prove to be much of a deterrent, as each bird shot was worth more than £5. The tail feathers of the Huia, and therefore their value, became even more prized when the Duke and Duchess of York, later George V and Queen Mary, visited New Zealand in 1901, whereas an official Maori welcome in Rotorua, a guise took a Huia feather from their hair and placed it in the band of the Duke's hat as a token of respect, which set off a further chain of events that sealed the fate of the Huia. Many people in New Zealand and abroad wanted to emulate this royal fashion the Duke had been seen with, and so the price of obtaining tail feathers was pushed up to £1 and the birds themselves being worth £12, nearly a doubling of previous values. The same year, shooting season notices ceased listing Huia as protected, and attempts to reinforce protections on them failed when the Solicitor General of the time ruled that there was no current law to protect the feathers and therefore the birds. 11 Maori hunters alone took 646 Huia skins from a forest between Manawatu Gorge and Arcoleo during 1 month in 1863 alone, and such rates continues and intensifies well into the early 1900s in places, until the birds became increasingly rare. The last Huia seen alive were 2 males and a female on December 28th of 1907, and while a few stragglers may have survived afterwards, with unconfirmed sightings continuing well into the 1920s and beyond, little has come from them. Some sightings, including a report of Huia calls in Te Urewera National Park in 1977, have also been noted, leading some to believe that a tiny relict population may persist there, though with no definitive evidence and continued mammal presence, much of this remains a big pipe dream. Cloning the birds from museum specimens has been proposed, though with the general poor state of the DNA from museum specimens, such a process would be especially unlikely to succeed, at least currently, especially considering cloning birds is a much less tested and understood field of cloning. As things develop though, and accessing and utilising said technology becomes refined, things could well change down the line, but that's a talk for another time. The ramifications of the extinction of the Huia were further wide-ranging in that with their absence, New Zealand's forests are left more vulnerable in terms of their own life histories. They rely heavily on frugivorous large birds like the Huia for seed dispersal, with about 70% of our woody plants having fruits that are predominantly dispersed by birds. With many of our larger birds, like the Huia and moa vanishing, for plants with fruit greater than 1 centimetre in diameter, kereroo are native pigeons and are the sole remaining seed dispersers in New Zealand forests, and they themselves are either rare or locally extinct in some areas where their habitat is lacking. This means that with this depletion of avifauna, our whole forest ecosystems are to an extent compromised in regards to forest regeneration and seed dispersal. When the Huia became extinct, they also took with them some less visible animals, being their parasites, something which was only discovered in 1990. This new discovery was that of a parasitic louse, which was named as Arcoleo extinctus, found within the feathers of a Huia skin held in a European museum. A Huia feather sold at an auction in Auckland sold for $8,000 New Zealand back in 2010, making it the most expensive feather auctioned ever, which goes to show just how much their remains are still valued. All of this, while exceptionally tragic in losing such an iconic bird, still considered today as one of New Zealand's most distinguished avifauna representatives, did inspire a good deal of progress. Their extinction marked a turning point in European attitudes to native species, whereby early conservation groups such as the Forestry League and the Forest and Bird Protection Societies were set up, as more environmental awareness about the plight of New Zealand's wildlife became more well known and understood. The European colonists, who caused much of the destruction that befell so many of our endemic birds, began to recognise the country for what it was rather than for what it could be as some kind of Little Britain. And while progress has often been painfully slow and frustrating to witness, it is being made by many different activists and people with an interest and a duty to protect our native wildlife. It's certainly something very admirable, and with continual efforts, the fate that befell Huia and so many others continues today as a lost icon which reminds us why we cannot give up our fight to protect our remaining wildlife, and so that we can avoid the extinctions of so many other of our fascinating animals. And with that, I thank you for watching this instalment of New Zealand's Bird of the Week. For next time, you're able to vote for the Kohatu shag, large extinct seabirds that were slightly smaller than their living relatives, the king shag. With that, I'll see you next time, whenever that may be.